Do you feel stuck? Are you still trying to outrun your past? Listen, things like containment and compartmentalization lead to all kinds of problems, especially things like addiction. So if you're looking for a better way, then stick around because in this episode of the Mental Health Toolbox, we are talking with Tate Barkley, accomplished attorney who shares his challenges, his journey to recovery, and what made the difference. So if you want to learn some new tools, stick around. Let's go. Tate Barkley grew up in the small towns of North Carolina, where money was tight, dreams seldom came true, and family secrets were kept hidden. His grandmother's house was a sanctuary where he felt loved, and her big Sunday dinners nourished his stomach and his soul. After his parents divorced, he discovered his mother's new boyfriend and eventual husband was actually his biological father, a charming dreamer who would disappear for months at a time, leaving his family to fend for themselves. As a teen, Tate began drinking. His father was a heavy drinker, and Tate was always looking for ways to connect with him, for a way to hold on to the moment before he slipped away again. Drinking gave Tate a sense of calm, and it numbed him for the love he was missing in his life. After years of drinking, losing his law practice, and hitting rock bottom, he realized he either needed to take responsibility and change, or he would end up dead. This is a Southern boy's story of surviving a good old boy's world. Tate fought his way back, ended a life built on lies, and forged a path to accept his true self, with or without his father's love. So, without further ado, let's meet Tate. So I'm curious, so that's huge. That's how you became sober, a big part of it. That was a period in your life. But there was still all of this, I'm guessing, other baggage, right? From the stigma around the sexuality and the coming out and your parents. And did you kind of knock all of that out in one swoop around the same time? I mean, it doesn't usually work that way, but did you have to circle back to that after the sobriety? Was that something you addressed prior?
And they encourage us to go about it with rigorous honesty.
Yeah.
And you got to be honest. And boy, that gets really hard when you've got a lot of secrets. Mm-hmm. And you grew up in a culture of shame. So to answer your question, before I crashed and burned, I began to come out to some of my friends. Mm-hmm. And I had started sort of living a double life. I had accepted my sexuality, being gay, up to the point of going to the bars and seeking out sex. Mm-hmm. But I didn't embrace being a gay man, and I certainly wasn't too terribly open about it. I told a few people, but I was willing to engage in the drinking and sex, but not be honest about it. Hey, how you doing, Patrick?
Hey, Tate, thank you so much for making time to join us on the Mental Health Toolbox to share your journey, your life story, and we all need the frequent inspiration and motivation from other people's lived experiences to know that it's not about where we begin in life, but how we handle things as they come, right? We're always a work in progress. So,
indeed.
Thank you for making time today. Absolutely. Absolutely. So you want to share a little bit about your journey, what got you into this space of sharing your struggles, your challenges around stigma, sexuality, mental health, and everything in between. And of course, how you still, in spite of all those challenges, managed to thrive in your law practice.
Well, I'll tell you, listen, Patrick, first, thank you for having me here today. Mm-hmm. I've become a fan of this podcast now that I've been made aware of it. You do some really good work here, and it's really special to be a part of the message and the work that you do on this podcast. So I appreciate it.
Oh, my honor and privilege. Thank you. You make it happen. So.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, and it, if only there was podcasting in the 1960s and 70s.
Right.
I started my life in Iredell County, North Carolina, and it was a very rural existence. And part of that existence was our lives centered around the church. And the church that we went to when I was a kid was a very fundamentalist church. It had a very strict constructionist view of the Bible. And so as such, that you were your sins. And so whether you were, whether you were an adulterer or whether you were gay, hence an abomination, that's what you were. And part of that culture and that dynamic was that not only if you have sinned, is it okay for us to shame you, but it's certainly okay, and we expect for you to shame yourself. So that was the place where I came from, and but in the early days, I had one particular grandmother of mine. The name of my book's called Sunday Dinners, Moonshine, and Men, and there was a great deal of chaos in my early life.
Mm-hmm.
So as such, the one safe place that I did go was to my grandmother Kirkman's house, and she would make these great Sunday dinners after church. And I hated to go home. I always wanted to stay with her, but she was that safe space. So over time, I realized that I had feelings and attractions for other guys,
Mm-hmm.
and that was very much considered an abomination from where I came from. And I'll never forget. And my father shared that view for a long, long time. And I'll never forget when I was in sixth grade, we were watching a CBS Evening News, and they had this small snippet about the Gay Pride Parade that had taken it, called the Great Gay Freedom Parade back then. And I'll never forget my dad. I was laying on the floor, and my dad just kicked me, and he said, "Bub, I better never." And I knew what he meant. He didn't have to finish the sentiment. So,
Tate, how old were you at this time?
Oh,
Like, do you remember?
I'm about sixth grade at this point
Sixth
in time.
grade. Okay.
Yeah, and at that time, I had developed a crush on my best friend, and that my best friend, as I talk about in the book, I have my first real sexual experience with him
Mm-hmm.
around that time, and we I just thought it was an incredible experience. It was like I had finally discovered who I was. But he eventually, my friend said, I think we should stop doing this. I feel like we're committing a sin.
Mm-hmm.
And I, of course, quickly agreed because I felt the same way. And it would be a long time before I would come to grips with that. And as that shame I developed young, eventually I needed to cope with it. And that's where my drinking really, really began.
Wow. So I know you just kind of dashed through that history, but I'm wondering, what was it like? I don't know about you, but for me, some of my earlier memories are very, very vague, very foggy. I just have like snapshots. But from what you recall, because you said it was a pretty rigid environment, what was it like growing up, even before you were maybe self-aware in terms of your sexuality and the juxtaposed position and the polarized environment, right?
Right.
Even with your dad, because we haven't dove into that yet, but you didn't even know your dad was your dad for a while. I'm sure you had your suspicions, but
Yeah.
from your earlier memories, what was it like growing up in that type of polarized environment?
Well, let me say for sure that, I think one of the things that I look back is everything is fine. It doesn't matter whether it's fine or not. Everything is fine. If you ask somebody what's going on with them, you're supposed to tell them it's fine. You didn't air your dirty laundry. So if there was something to be ashamed or embarrassed about, you just didn't talk about it. And I think one of the first things that I really picked up on. And you just didn't talk about things. No matter what's going on, you tell people everything's okay. And I think that was one of the things in terms of mental health. It was totally discouraged that you shared about things that you were confused about or worried about because everything is just fine.
So we're not just talking about sexuality. We're talking about any kind of showing of your belly, right? Being conflicted, going against the grain, right?
Yeah, it
Everyone
isn't.
just put on a proud face and
You're all just fine, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about your sexuality or money
mm-hmm.
or the fact that your dad got arrested or any of that. everything was going to be just fine, and you don't talk about it. And I remember my grandmothers used to say, they didn't say if somebody was struggling, they would just look at you and say, he's just never been quite right. So
Mm.
that's how things were sort of discussed in those days. So there was no real conversation that we ever had as a family about anything, Patrick. I mean, about anything other than, we got to do this and we got to do that, about whatever chores had to be done. And
Very transactional. Just
right. All very transactional.
Yeah.
You got it. So, and it's not that there weren't people that I didn't feel love from. I felt love from my mom. I felt love from my grandmother, but it was couched in a way to where, we just don't want other people to know what's going on. And once I started feeling these feelings towards other guys, I mean, I knew immediately I shouldn't tell anybody. I mean, I definitely should not tell anybody. So, yeah.
What were you afraid of happening if you spoke up or even questioned it or tried to have a conversation with your parents about it? Hey, mom, hey, dad, I'm feeling this way. Is that normal? Or, I mean, you obviously didn't feel safe sharing openly your feelings.
I did not. I mean, because my fear is that they wouldn't love me anymore. That was my biggest fear. Mm-hmm. And the ramifications or consequences of not being loved anymore, I wasn't sure what they are, but I knew that a rumor had it that there had been another family member who had maybe had attractions to people of the same sex, and they were totally disowned and shunned from
black sheep. Yeah, shunned.
Yeah, and I didn't want that to happen to me. And of course, when you're little, that really frightens you because you're totally dependent on those people around you. So that was my great fear, is that I just wouldn't be loved and that I would be shunned. And God forbid you embarrass the family. That was amazing. And of course, if you were questioning, your sexuality, or if you were thought to be gay, that would be a horrible family embarrassment. And you're just not to do that.
Yeah, so it was definitely off the table, right?
Yeah.
And so that was the environment you grew up in, and I imagine that weighed on you after a while, walking on eggshells and towing the line, as they say, with family expectations.
Yeah, it did for me. Eventually, my early on when I was born, my mom was married to a man named Gene. And the way the laws were back in those days, I was born way back in 1965. And the way the laws were in those days is that your legal father is whoever your mom is married to. The rest really didn't matter. The DNA of it all didn't matter. That's just the way the rules were. So, and my mom stayed married to her husband till I was about 5 years old. And so I never knew my dad was my dad. My natural father was my dad till much later. And his name was also, my natural father was also named Tate. So when I turned about 6 or 7, Tate finally came to live with us. And so I was in a household with my real dad. But Tate he was a drinker. He was a dreamer. He was very charismatic. I loved being around him. But he had a bad habit, Patrick, of just disappearing for months on end, leaving us without any
It's not
money.
very conducive for a, healthy home. Yeah.
He was a mess is what he was. And I, in the midst of so much of that, one of the things that he did that always did seem fun is he drank and he smoked. He always seemed to be in a good place when he drank. And so I grew up wanting to drink. And the first time my dad, he eventually moved us to Houston whenever I was about 12. And we moved into this great big old apartment complex in Houston, Texas. I mean, everybody was like us. They were poor. They were scrambling to find work, and they had left someplace in a rush. Like my dad, we left North Carolina because there were 2 warrants out for his arrest.
Mm.
And Dad couched the move as, "Oh, we're going to Houston. It's booming. We're going to build a new life there." And
The reframe. Yeah.
yeah, oh, he was a master of the reframe.
Right.
Yeah, and he was always the hero.
Mm-hmm.
So that being said, and we came to Houston, and it was, I swear to God, I was in 7th grade at the time, and I was just falling in love with every guy I saw. I was a mess, and it was getting very difficult to fight it. And I remember a friend of mine, Bruce, he handed me a beer one night along the bayou we had behind the apartment complex, and I got my first beer buzz, and it was absolutely magical.
Right. Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah, yeah.
So is Houston like, because I'm obviously from California, LA, I haven't been around much. Want to at some point travel the nation, but North Carolina to Houston, what is that culture dynamic shift like? Are they vastly different? Is one more urban than the other? I mean, you have to educate me here.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite the culture shock, and it was a culture shock this way. I several ways. Number one, we lived in a very rural environment. I always went to small schools, and even in in North Carolina, we didn't have, in those days. I mean, of course, we had African Americans, and we had just started going to school with African Americans in North Carolina. And because you got to remember, the southern states were very slow to enforce Brown versus Topeka Board of Education,
Mm-hmm.
which basically said you could not have segregated schools. But many school districts were still segregated and slow to follow that order. That being said, when we came to, it was always very small classes, and there were black students and there were white students, but that was the extent of it. When I came to Texas, there were Asian students in Houston, more specifically Houston, which is a big urban area. Even then, it was the 5th largest city in the United States. And we moved into this apartment complex, where you had a lot of other poor working class folks too. And I want to tell you, you had people from everywhere, from Mexico, from Canada, Missouri, all over the United States. Our neighbors were from Brooklyn. The folks upstairs were from North Dakota. The guy across the place was actually from Mexico. So it was just this hodgepodge of people. And I wasn't accustomed to that. And so it made for a very different social dynamic that I had to get accustomed to very quick.
Uh-huh. So how old were you when you guys ended up moving from Houston? Because he came into your life around, you said she was married to your stepfather until you were 5, right?
Yeah, right.
Which means they divorced. And that's a whole other thing you probably went through, that attachment with the divorce as a 5-year-old, right?
Yeah. And what had happened was, kind of the sequence of events around the time I was 5 or 6, my mom finally left her husband, the man I had been calling dad, who wasn't really my dad. And then when she got together with my real father, Tate, we moved to Florida for a while and tried to make it as a family. And he was a dreamer. He was going to get rich in Florida real estate, but wind up going broke. So we came back to North Carolina to try to live again together, and he went broke again. So that's what took us to Texas. So by the time we went to Texas, I was about 12 or 13.
Oh, okay. So there was a big chunk of time between when he came in and you guys uprooted. You uprooted twice.
Yeah, we uprooted. Yeah, we uprooted to go to Florida. Then we uprooted out of Florida to go back to North Carolina. Then we uprooted again.
Technically 3 times. Yeah, that's a lot on a kid.
Then we uprooted again to go to Texas, and really, it was really more times than that. I talk about it at the book. In my 4th grade year, I went to 4 different schools, so it was quite the. In my 3rd grade year, I went to 3 different schools, because we just couldn't pay the rent wherever we went. Dad just couldn't come up with the money. So we were constantly changing housing situations. And so eventually he just gave up on it all, and we came to Houston. And I can say that my mom has lived in the same house for 40 some years now. When Dad brought us to Houston, we stayed here. So it was a good move.
Good, good. Never know where life's going to take you, huh?
No, you don't. No, you don't.
Yeah. I mean, I can kind of relate to that. I grew up, we lost our house when I was 5. And then I remember I had a bit of a reframe too. My mother said, "Hey, we're going, do you mind if we go on vacation for a while?" And she had used, I guess, the proceeds from the house to buy a motorhome, right?
Yeah.
So for the next 11 years, I spent on vacation and in a motorhome going from like KOA to KOA across California, and landed somewhere in Northern California and then made my way back in my teens. But man, yeah, that was a long vacation.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, you know all about it then, don't you?
Yeah. We
You know
moved
what?
like, yeah, same thing. Couldn't pay the rent. We were moving like every as soon as I would make friends, we'd be in a different trailer park.
Yeah, I was
So,
just telling folks, presently, I sit on the board of directors for an agency that builds and develops home for affordable housing for people who are poor and vulnerable populations. And I just told the story the other day. I said that to I went to 4 different schools when I was in 4th grade, and that level of instability, you can't get as a kid. You can't get a grip. You can't. You need friends as a kid. And you need a sense of stability. And while I would go from one school to the next, well, some had started fractions, some had not started fractions, and you never really master anything academically when you're moving so much, and you never feel safe because you're constantly moving. And I don't know about you, but it was always a challenge to make new friends in a new place. And if you're constantly having to do it, you feel like you can't rely on anything or
mhm.
anybody.
Yeah, don't get too attached because, don't get too comfortable, I should say. Yeah.
I got to tell you, I think that stability is so incredibly important for a kid, and knowing that you can count on being in the same house and going to the same school, and you have the same support structure in your life. It's just huge. And I think a great deal of my inability to cope the way perhaps what we might call well-adjusted people cope came from the fact that we moved around a lot. It not only sprang from that sense of shame I had about being gay, but is it that we were constantly in transition, and you couldn't rely upon anything. And
Yeah. Well, I think when we have a lot of uncertainty in our lives, especially as children, and if our homes are not, like as you say, consistent, the parenting's not consistent, the environment's not consistent. It's just like as adults, it's in an unstable relationship. It's hard to bring up the deeper issues if we're still trying to find our footing,
yeah,
right? As a
that's
kid, you don't want to rock the boat, right? If you can already see that things are unstable, right, in the home, you don't necessarily want to open up another can of worms.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
You don't feel like you have the freedom to do so, right?
That is so true. And I had, as time went on, during this time, I had 3 younger sisters. My mom and my dad had more kids, so I had 3 baby sisters,
Hmm.
and they became my stability. I mean, tending to them. I tell folks, I said, I don't have any kids now, but because I raised my kids when I was younger, and I think that was my 3 younger sisters, because we were always moving around. So the only stability I had was really my 3 younger sisters, and being with them, and having them as a part of my life. But when it came to friends, schools, subject matter, that kind of thing, that kind of consistency wasn't around.
Yeah. Wow. So at what point then do you feel like did you feel like your mother ever settled into the relationship, or do you feel like she was always struggling? Because I know she said she struggled in her prior marriage. Your biological father had some of his own behavioral issues. Do you feel like she was ever independent in her own right, or was she more kind of flailing about?
I think, well, I don't know if flailing about's the right way, how I'd put it. What I would, she was dependent, and she had a daughter from her first marriage, and she had me and my three younger sisters. So all in, she had five kids that she had to worry about.
It's a lot.
Yeah,
It's a lot
and
for anyone.
yeah, and she was totally dependent on the men in her life. So I don't know that she ever really felt that sense of independence like we all seek, I think.
Hmm. Hmm.
Her worry always seemed to be, about trying to make sure that we were taken care of. And if that meant staying in a marriage with someone who was not maybe the best of husbands,
Hmm.
and my dad, was not the best of husbands. He was a heavy drinker. He could be abusive. He was narcissistic. Um, so it was not ideal for my mom. I think that sense of independence that did come in time, but much older in life for her.
Hmm.
And it was really, once we were out of the house, mom began building that independence. But I think my mom, in many ways, Patrick, felt compelled to stay because she was afraid that she couldn't provide for us kids. So,
Hmm.
and that she just had this feeling of being stuck. And and like I said, there were times when my dad could be physically abusive. It wasn't
Hmm.
often, but it happened too much. And that's kind of where I had a love hate relationship with my dad, and certainly the hate came from his utter self absorption, and then his abusiveness physically,
Hmm.
emotionally toward my mom, and then often emotionally towards us kids.
Sure. Sure, I can imagine. So you were feeling a lot for your mom, seeing her struggle. You were the oldest child, sometimes what we'd call the parentified child,
Yeah,
because you're watching after your siblings. So there was a lot of expectation placed on you.
yeah.
So, and
And
meanwhile, you're going through puberty, you're figuring yourself out. You just went through this big, huge move, and one more reason to not rock the boat,
yeah, not to
right?
rock the boat. And
Yeah.
one more reason, I'll tell you, I think one of the most memorable, and I alluded to it earlier, one of the most memorable moments of my life is whenever my buddy Bruce handed me a little 7 ounce Miller High Life that used to be called the King of Beers, and I drank
Mm-hmm.
one, then I drank two, and I caught that beer buzz on the banks of that bayou in Houston, and I felt like Superman. It was the first time that I felt good about being me, and that beer buzz was so good. It was the best one I ever had, the first one, and
Mm-hmm.
I chased trying to duplicate that feeling for another 20 some years before I got sober.
Right. As is usually the case, right?
You're right,
Yeah.
indeed. Yeah, the
So I know
best buzz
you
is
said
the
your dad struggled with alcoholism. We know that alcoholism runs in the genes, right? There is a
yeah, yeah.
predisposition. But at what point did you actually discover that he was your biological father? Did that come on later in life, or was that something you figured out in your teens?
Yeah, it happened in the oddest of ways. I always suspected the first time that I met this man called Tate, who was my natural father. The first time I met this man called Tate, and I talk about it in the book, where he's standing by a chain link fence and he's coming to pick me up. And my dad was, uh, a good looking guy and tall, handsome. And I remember meeting him for the first time. And I remember feeling something like, okay, I feel like I know this guy, but I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know this guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he picked me up that day, and that was the first time we met from my nursery school. And he would show up every now and then once mom left her first husband, Gene. And then he started spending the night there with us. So my mom had not told me that he was my dad. They didn't think I could handle it. So it wasn't until I was in fifth grade that my mom, and here's the important part about the scene. Dad abandoned us down in Florida, and we had to call our kin people to come pick us up. We were out of food, we were out of water, we didn't have any power, And if it hadn't been for the kindness of our neighbors, we would have not ate or bathed for like a month. And Dad just had disappeared. Well, Mom finally called our kin people to come pick us up and take us back to North Carolina. Eventually, about 6 months later, Dad comes a calling in North Carolina and says he wants to put the family back together.
Mm.
I hated the man. He had abandoned us, and I didn't want anything to do with him. But I knew my mom couldn't rely upon the kindness of kin people for the rest of our lives, too.
Right.
So when he decided that he wanted to put the family back together, that's when Mom told me that Tate was my natural father.
Mm.
And I'll never forget it. She and my Aunt Sissy, which was my dad's sister, told me together. My Aunt Sis put, you know, a little bit of beer in front of me and said, "Here, you can have this." So I shot it back and I said, "Look, thanks for telling me, but I know he's my dad." Because I just knew. I mean, it's
Yeah.
hard to say. I just knew.
Right.
And so that's how I found out.
And you would have been exactly how old at that time?
I was 12 years old.
12 years old. So yeah, all around that time in your life, a lot of going on.
There was a hell of a lot going on around that time.
Yeah. So
no wonder I like drinking so much.
Yeah, right. And I was going to ask about that. So alcohol, you took a liking to it. You saw it was obviously accepted in the home because this is what Dad did.
Yeah.
Do you feel like alcohol was welcomed? Like, did you drink openly, or when did you start drinking with your dad, if that was the case? I know that's common with a lot of alcoholic father-son situations, that sometimes the dad will encourage the drinking as a bonding experience. Was that your experience at all?
Not really. I mean, yes and no is how I can answer that. I first started, as I said, I had that first beer buzz and I chased it ever since.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened when I was in 7th grade. And at that point in time, my hormones were going crazy, Patrick.
Oh, yeah. I can imagine.
And so, but, I couldn't be gay and I couldn't act upon them. So the drinking helped me cope. And that began my mission, trying to find alcohol to drink. Became, my job starting around 7th grade, and finding friends who could access booze became, that's how I chose my friends. Would they drink, and could they access booze? But my dad he drank constantly, but he never allowed me to drink unless he gave it to me. So he started giving me beer to drink probably around my freshman year in high school. But by then I was drinking on the weekends anyway.
Right. You'd built up an appetite for it.
Right.
Say. Yeah.
So, and he and I, by the time I got out of high school and went into college, he and I were official drinking buddies. And I didn't hate him anymore. Yeah, I'll be honest with you, with the way he treated Mom and with the instability that he had created in our lives, I hated the man, Patrick. I mean, and it's not like I hid it that much from him. But once we became drinking buddies, that entire relationship changed. I loved being around my dad, and I loved hanging out with him. And he became someone that I spoke to and talked with and asked for advice from, but yet I didn't trust in him enough to tell him I was gay, and I didn't trust in him enough to tell him really my secrets. But he was a good drinking buddy, because my dad was a lot of fun when you went out drinking.
Yeah. It almost sounds like you learned to compartmentalize your life.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to put it, Patrick. That's how I conducted myself, in compartments.
Yeah. This is even compartments within compartments, like your relationship with your dad. And this is in this silo of how we bond. I accept him, but outside of this, I hate him. So there's a lot of this ambivalence going on, a lot of these mixed emotions.
Oh my God. And that's a wonderful way to put it, because when we were drinking, I did love him because he was a lot of fun. But, then when we were sober, when I would see him, if I would see how he would talk to my mom, how he would belittle my mom, then I would hate him again. And as I got older, I began, pointing that out to him. And then we would quickly start to drinking, and then we were buddies again. My adult relationship with my dad was totally centered around drinking. And and that was it. So when I got sober, here was the hard lift with that relationship for me, Patrick, is when I got sober, I hated him again, and I really didn't want to be around him. Um, I I started drinking, weekly for sure in high school, and by the time I made it to college, I was drinking 2 or 3 times a week. And by the time I made it to law school, I was drinking what I call alcoholically, which was to cope on a daily
Hmm.
basis to cope. But I managed to get through law school. I managed to pass the Texas bar exam, and I built a very successful personal injury practice. But eventually, my drinking just kind of got away from me, and I lost every bit of it. And at 33, I had to move back home with my parents
Hmm.
because I had lost my home, my car, all my money, all my clients, my law practice to drinking. And it was drinking that did it. And there I was standing in the garage with my dad all over again, getting drunk. And then whenever I finally got the courage to get sober, I didn't have anywhere to go. I spent 28 days in a treatment center, and then I was going to have to go home with my parents because when I lost everything, I moved back in with my parents.
So was that the turning point for you? When
Yeah,
you after the rehab, or did it take some finessing after that? Like what for you? What was like kind of like the I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired of this
my
cycle.
yeah, my sick and tired of being sick and tired. Well, one, I it happened once I got sober. To answer
Hmm.
your question,
Mm.
and
Okay.
and the day I came home from rehab, my dad picked me up at the airport drunk. And we went back to my mom and dad's house, and one of my sisters was there. And my mom had gone to, my mom and my sister had kept asking me when I was in rehab, what can we do to help? And I said, well, they keep telling me for y'all to go to an Al Anon meeting. And those are folks, usually family members and wives and husbands that go
Hmm.
to,
To learn how
to
to support their loved ones who are dealing with addiction,
right.
alcoholism, right?
Absolutely. And when my mom said she had gone, my dad, who picked me up drunk at the airport from rehab, I just got in from rehab, and uh, he belittled my mom and my sister, and he was just so drunk that night. I think he was trying to prove a point. He was afraid that everyone was going to start encouraging him to stop drinking, and he wasn't about to. So that night I went to live with my sister. My baby sister, who had just been married 3 months, just put her hand on
Mm.
mine and she said, you need to come live with me. And she was right. And that was the first time that I prioritized what was best for me over what was best for mom and what was best for dad.
It also sounds like reciprocity, because here the sister that you stepped in and helped take care of when you were younger now is
Right.
able to step in and take care of
She
big brother,
she
right?
she sure did. And
Yeah.
and I've had a life full of saints in it, and she's certainly one of those angels and saints. And so was her husband of 3 months. I mean, imagine that, Patrick, that
Hmm.
you're married to somebody for 3 months and they bring their unemployed, fresh out of rehab brother to come live with you.
Takes a
Yeah,
lot of acceptance, love, trust. Yeah.
it does. It does. So I started my sober life living with my baby sister and her husband of 3 months. But that's just how it had to be.
Hmm.
And we land where we have to land to get sober.
So what I'm hearing is that you must have said to yourself, I can't stay sober and live at home with mom and
Yeah,
dad. Like
yeah.
that's not gonna fly.
I think there are two things that really happened. I had lost everything, and when I went back to live with my mom and dad after losing my law practice, all I did was drink all day. And I had one particular day that changed everything. Patrick, was I was the only one at the house, and I was drinking liquor that day, hard liquor that day. And then I woke up on the floor of the garage, and I had wet myself and defecated in my sweatpants I was wearing. and I stand 5'7", and at this time I was 222 pounds, which is
Mm-hmm.
about a good 60 pounds overweight for
Mm-hmm.
my frame. And I got up a big mess, and I thought to myself, I cannot live with alcohol anymore, and I can't live without it. I've tried everything. I had been to rehab before. I had used an assortment of drugs to withdraw. I had tried non-alcoholic beer. I had tried everything to quit, and I couldn't quit. So I still had about 40. I had 20 tablets of 40 milligram Valium that I had secreted away, and I grabbed my dad's Johnny Walker Black whiskey bottle, and I poured all of those tablets, Valium tablets, in my hand, and I said, I might as well just get end it
Mm.
now. I don't know how to cope.
So it
I
got
don't,
pretty dark. Yeah.
and then I thought for a minute. I said, well, I don't know that I want mom to find me, and so I put the tablets back and said, and then in my head I'm going to go back to them, and I said, I remember my friend AJ. He always said, before you do anything really stupid, Tate, why don't you call these people at Hazleton? He was a doctor, an MD,
Mm-hmm.
and he was a good friend of mine, you know, while I had the law practice. And he kept encouraging me to get sober and or to go to Hazleton because I kept telling him, I think I'm drinking too much, but I can't stop, whatever. And luckily for me, talk about angels in your life. I called Hazleton, and there was this guy named Ted on the other end of the phone, and he's talked to me on the phone for 2.5 hours. And by the end of that 2.5 hour conversation, I'd gotten my wits about me again. And my next call was to my buddy Greg. I was broke. I had no health insurance and I had no money. So I called my buddy Greg, who was a dear friend of mine, who had bailed me out of countless situations in the past. And he figured out how to get me to Hazleton. And 8 days later, I was in treatment up in Center City, Minnesota. That event was important. And then when I got picked up at the airport by my drunk father and had to go live with my sister, I knew that it was utterly insane for me to go back to that life. And I needed to do whatever I had to do. And that's when I started honest recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And in full frankness, I'm a 12-step guy because
Mm-hmm.
that's what they told us up in,
A treatment center.
yeah, at Hazleton. They were a 12-step. They were belt and suspenders AA up there, for alcoholics. So, and then that's where my journey in recovery started.
So I'm curious. So that's huge. That's how you became sober. A big part of it. That was a period in your life. But there was still all of this, I'm guessing, other baggage, right? From
Yeah,
the stigma around the sexuality and the coming
yeah.
out and your parents. And did you kind of knock all of that out in one swoop around the same time? I mean, it doesn't usually work that way, but did you have to circle back to that after the sobriety? Was that something you addressed prior? Because when you're doing
Well,
12 step and your inventory
yeah.
and all of this hard work and facing your demons and, getting down to brass tacks with everyone. I mean, this is some of in a 12 step sense, some of the dirty work.
It is, and
Yeah.
and they encourage us to go about it with rigorous honesty,
Yeah.
and you got to be honest. And boy, that gets really hard when you've got a lot of secrets,
Mm-hmm.
and you grew up in a culture of shame. So to answer your question, before I crashed and burned, I began to come out to some of my friends,
Mm-hmm.
and I had started sort of living a double life. I had accepted my sexuality, being gay, up to the point of going to the bars and seeking out sex.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't embrace being a gay man, and I certainly wasn't too terribly open about it. I told a few people, but I was willing to engage in the drinking and sex, but not be honest about it. And I share with folks, I didn't really come to grips with being a gay man until I got sober, because I deep down inside, for a lot of years, I just felt, maybe this attraction to guys, it's just kind of comes and goes.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, even though I constantly thought about them, I said, I've managed to be with women. I've managed, to date and to
Mm-hmm.
have sex with women. So maybe, I mean, I convinced myself I could make being straight work
Right.
until I couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so I finally started coming clean to everybody, living as an out and open gay man when I got sober. And so some people did know before I got sober, but most did not. And I didn't tell my dad until, oh my God, I mean, near the end of his life.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of the so much of, I talk about that process in the book, is I began living an out and open gay life to everybody but my dad. And I don't know what it was about him or our relationship where I couldn't be honest with him. Um, but I just couldn't. And until I told him, I recognized I couldn't really be whole. So that so much about the book, Sunday Dinners, Moonshine, and Men, is about that relationship with Dad, and why it was I struggled so desperately with him in telling the truth. And but my sisters told me whenever I came out to them, they basically told me that they knew.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, how'd you know? And I'm
Yeah.
just like, people who love you are intuitive about things, I think.
Yeah. Respect your privacy.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, but that was it. And I couldn't be around gay people unless I was drunk, Patrick,
Mm-hmm.
because I still had this sense of shame about being gay.
Well,
Like,
yeah. There's.
I'm not one of you people. Now I'll get drunk with you and I'll have sex with you, but
Mm-hmm.
I am not you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now I'm going to go home now, or after we've had sex and gotten drunk together, and now I'm going to go back to my life.
That compartmentalizing again. Right.
Yeah, that's exactly
Yeah.
what I did. And like I said, sobriety, I began to have to work on that, and I did. And I got sober after about 6 or 7 months of sobriety. I moved into a duplex with my best friend from high school. Her name's Jody, and thank God, she lived about 3 blocks from the Lambda Center. And the
Mm-hmm.
Lambda Center here in Houston is a place of recovery meetings for the queer community.
Mm-hmm.
AA meetings, NA meetings, CMA
That's great.
meetings, and
Yeah.
and so I was able to walk to go to recovery meetings
Yeah.
with people in the queer community, or all were welcome, but it was mostly folks in the queer community, and that began my process of getting comfortable with my people. And I did it in sobriety, though.
Yes. So that was a big part of the whole deal. And just to kind of reflect, right, on everything you've shared, it's pretty well understood in the mental health space that when we have a lot of rigidity, right, in our home environments, where there's a lot of stigma, a lot of walking on eggshells, when one doesn't feel comfortable to share their struggles, their demons, oftentimes they will find unhealthy ways then to express those things. Whereas if they had a healthy, open environment where they felt safe to take those risks and share what's going on within them, like AKA with caregivers, parents, then they would not be as prone to taking such high risk behavior in order to express that angst, right? That containment, those things they've contained. And so that's a very, common outcome of containment, as we say, is compartmentalization. So, and it can, have very dire consequences, right? As you've experienced, you nearly committed suicide, and
And I tell you, I struggled with honesty, and I can share with you, before my husband, we've been together for 11 years now, and before my husband, I never had a romantic relationship longer than about 3 months.
Hmm.
I just, I was not comfortable with people knowing me, even once I got into sobriety. I had a lot of work to do, Patrick, once I got into sobriety. I wish I could say, man, I got sober and boom, it was, I was
Yeah.
all better.
Doesn't usually work that way.
It doesn't work that way. I had, I had, I had so much work to do, and on a lot of things, but I was incapable of doing it drinking because uh, I'll speak for myself here. When I was in addiction, and I not only was an alcoholic, but I was addicted to prescription, having lots of Valium and Librium and all of that stuff around, Rohypnol even,
Mm.
was not uncommon for me. I loved drugging myself and getting drunk at the same time. It's amazing. I'm amazed I'm alive. I really am.
Hmm.
And um, so I lied about so many things in my and I was incapable of being rigorously honest almost about anything until I got sober. And then even once I got sober, I struggled with it. But in time, I was able to do it. And the reason I was able to do it is that therapy, I went to therapy, recovery meetings, being around people who loved me, I could share those things that I was afraid of, those secrets, whether it was being gay or the fact that I went to court drunk, or I could share all those terrible, awful things and feel safe. And
Hmm.
you hit the nail on the head when you talked about whether you're a child, but even if you're an adult, you need to feel like you're in a safe place, in a non-judgmental place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So crucial. I was about to ask, what are some of the nuggets of wisdom you would impart to any of our listeners or viewers about maybe if they're going through some struggles with orientation, or if it's addiction or containment, family secrets? How might you encourage them to navigate these muddy waters, if you were?
I'll tell you, I would sort of divide it up into, you know, parents and then friends and colleagues out there who are listening first. My dad and mom, when I came out to both of them, I did not come out to them together. I came out to my mom earlier than I did my dad. And both of them said, son, like when I came out to my mom, she said, your dad and I talked about this when you were in high school. They
Mm.
suspected I might be gay because I had a friend of mine, who was not out, but he
Mm-hmm.
was considered flamboyant, if
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and I had several guy friends, and he was gay, um, which is why it was very important to me always to be straight acting, as we say in the community, because I didn't want anybody to find out. So she said, your dad and I talked about it. And then my dad, when I eventually finally told him, said the same thing. Your mom and I talked about it. And I want to give this, if I could give advice to some parents, if you're talking to each other about it, it would be nice to maybe share with your son or daughter. Say, look, you do know that in the event there's something you want to tell us, that if you're gay or bi or whatever, that's okay. You can tell us and we still love you. And to
Mm-hmm.
just maybe open that conversation to where you let them know that your child is going to be loved and be given total support and total love without judgment. I think that's an important conversation. Because if my folks would have come to me when I was 16, Patrick, I'll tell you, I probably would have still denied it. No, 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 I'm not
Yeah. Yeah.
gay. But at least I would have known that whenever I was ready, I could go to them and not worry about being shamed or judged.
Mm.
But I was worried about it. I mean, I didn't have enough confidence in my parents to not judge or shame me. So if you're parents and you can convey that to your kids, you can. And for those kids that live in maybe judgmental households, those fundamentalist, you know,
Mm-hmm.
communities like I started my life in the Deep South. I worry for them, and I do hope their parents find the love and the grace to be good to their children and to let them know that you're still going to love them if they come out. So I have
Right.
that bit of advice. And I have, and the other thing that I would share with folks out there that are thinking about or struggling with their orientation or being gay, I will tell you, you are not alone. Oh, for heaven's sakes, you are not alone. I struggled mightily with being gay, but then I found a community that loved me, that I feel safe in. And they're out there. There are so many people out there that are going to love you, even though you may be gay or bi or feel like that you're trapped in the wrong body. There's going to be folks that love you, and there's going to be some tough spots. But the first thing is to seek out folks who are not going to judge you.
Mm-hmm.
Is to go find those places, those safe places. And what I would say to someone who fears that they may have some sort of addiction of some sort is the same thing. There is a place that you can go. You can go to a 12-step recovery meeting, AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. Nothing says, there's no membership fee. There's no
Right.
rules. You all you have to do is think that maybe you have a problem. That's it. That entitles you to walk in the door and say what you want to say. You are entitled to a seat at the table. All you got to do is think, well, maybe I do have a problem, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
just
Keep an open mind, right? Low humility, open mind.
just show
Yeah.
up and see what
Right.
happens. What's the worst thing that can happen? I promise you, nothing bad will happen. Just
Right.
think about going.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really touches on two really, I think, really important things. And that is that if something's perceived to be real, it can oftentimes be real in its consequences, right?
Mhm.
That's the Thomas theorem in sociology. And basically, it's like you're saying, like, even if you're a teenager, even if you're, as parents, you feel like, oh, we're accepting, but if the teenager doesn't have anything to go off of, like, to actually believe that, if they don't believe that you're approachable around a subject, then they're still going to contain,
That's right.
right? And so it's important for caregivers, for parents, to set the stage and just say, hey, open floor anytime you want, open mic, right?
Open
No
mic. All
judgment,
right. Indeed.
right? And also the proximity principle, right? Which is, sometimes the people in the closest proximity to you are not the best sounding boards, and so we have to sometimes, if you don't feel supported at home or your environment, then you have to go a little outside your bubble, right, to go find the proper support. But it doesn't mean the support's not there.
That's right. That's
Right.
right. You're not alone. No matter what your
Right.
affliction, I promise you, you're not alone.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Tate. So you have a lot going on. I can't wait to check out your book.
Thank you.
Right?
Yeah. Thank
I
you.
love the title. Sunday Dinners, Moonshine, and Men.
Indeed.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's your memoir. And this is already up and available, right?
It is. It is. It's at a bookseller near you, and you can certainly get it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or bookshop.org if you like going with the independents. It's there, and we've got a free excerpt on my website is tatebarkley.com. There's a free excerpt on the book on that, and
Wonderful.
if
Oh, yeah, right here. I see it.
yeah, right, it's right there, and if you have any more questions, you can just email me at tatebarkley.com, and I always answer those emails. So it's okay.
Oh,
It's
wonderful. Great. And you have an active, it's on Amazon, of course. Like you said, probably Barnes & Noble, everywhere books are found, as well as got some stuff going on your YouTube channel here, right?
yeah, indeed.
Very good. You're active on Facebook, Instagram.
I'm at Tate Barkley at Facebook and Instagram. And my LinkedIn is Michael Tate Barkley. As you talked about earlier, I do have a law firm, and I remain very active, a practicing attorney. So
Yeah.
LinkedIn is Michael Tate Barkley, and I'm there.
Excellent. Well, you're a wealth of wisdom. I very much appreciate all of what you shared today and your journey, and hopefully I'm sure it will provide inspiration and motivation for our listeners and viewers to get the help they need and the support. They know they're not alone, right?
Yeah.
Wherever they may be found, California, Texas, and abroad.
Yeah, indeed,
Right.
everywhere. Patrick, thank you for this work. I mean, thank you for the work you do with this podcast and in sharing. Just this is a really awesome podcast with the work you do, and it's my honor to be on it. So thank
Oh,
you
thank you.
again.
It's my privilege to have you on, and you make the show, and this is about raising awareness, for those who maybe feel like they're alone or need a little leg up and a little motivation, resources. So thank you for your contribution to the community.
You got it.
And you're always welcome back on, to share what's going on with you and the wonderful work you're doing. So,
Thank you, sir.
thank you. All right. With that, you have a great week, okay?
All right. Thank you,
All right.
Patrick.
Thank you. Bye-bye.